That has not been in the news lately because, except for the for saying that the rates are going to stay steady because of the Iran war inflation concern. But unbeknownst to most people, if you have looked on the website of the balance sheet, this has been ticking up right over here. I don't think I need that spotlight. And why is that? Well, when you shrink the balance sheet, um, the banks are, I don't know if you know about fractional reserves. Right now, they're officially not called fractional reserves anymore, but there's still a liquidity like ratio or something like that, where the banks have to have a certain amount of reserves or cash, not physical cash, but they have to have digital reserves, um, a certain ratio against what's against depositor accounts or loans. So they can only make a certain amount of loans per cash in the digital vault. So the Fed, in order to keep the credit running without a crunch, without a standstill, with expansion being stopped, the Fed buys securities, treasuries from the banks, and that's what this is. The balance sheet is. So usually the QE that we know about is when the Fed buys long-term 10-year treasuries. So the Fed is saying this time is different because we're buying short-term rates. Now, the official logic is that they're not buying long-term, so the 10-year treasury is going to stay the same, the mortgage rate is going to stay the same, and they're keeping the Fed overnight rate window, the 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 rate at which the Fed pays banks to keep the money at the Fed, and the rate at which the Fed loans banks money. So that window is basically the 3.5% window. Um, I think it's like a quarter point above that. So the Fed's saying we're not going to do QE. We're only buying short-term treasury securities from banks. So that shouldn't affect the long term, and it's going to allow banks to make more loans at the at whatever the mortgage rate is. I think this is only the fractional reserve only affects overnight lending between banks. Banks just because the banks have more fractional reserve capacity, they're not going to make more cheaper loans on the mortgage side. That's separate. But what I'm saying is the Fed is still making around because there people the if there's more money in the economy, you're still expanding M2, and eventually it's going to inflate the cost of other assets, and then once you inflate assets, you're going to raise if there's higher inflation expectation, then the 10-year treasury will be affected. So in the long term, it will affect the other end of the yield curve. So it's there's just kicking the can down the road using more obfuscation, more tricks, but they're not actually doing anything different tactically or strategically. I should say they're not doing anything different strategically. They're using more tactics. The whole Fed is a big obfuscation. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, but the entire Fed. I'm going to show you. I have a I have a Gemini here, actual conversation before I started last night. Uh, it's a whole long thing. I'm going to let you read it yourself. Um, and yeah, it's just sad, but I think gold's overbought. Even it corrected itself, but I think it's overbought because even if we haven't had inflation of 200% and gold already went past twice what it was before this whole thing started. Like 2 years ago, gold was less than half of what it is now. So it's already overbought. Bitcoin is a big is a it's not a Ponzi scheme, it's a pyramid scheme, and the energy used, whatever. There's a whole video on that. I'm not getting into that, but there isn't really any options except for buying assets that get inflated by the Fed. You can't fight the Fed. You can't do a GameStop thing where you short the Fed because the market will be irrational longer than you can be solvent. That's the phrase. right? So you just there's no way there's nothing to do but to play along. You have a inherent disadvantage. Most people have an inherent disadvantage in that you're a W-2 worker and you get a salary. Yeah, you might have a 401k, an IRA, you might even have your own house. You might even be upper middle class and have three rental properties to make money off of. But you probably still have a salary. Whereas if someone lives on just capital gains and multiple revenue streams from assets, they have the advantage. Now eventually, if it's a slow collapse, those people will never really have an issue. If there is a if the government lets there be a crisis or doesn't step in a crisis and kick the can further, yeah, everybody is gonna have a problem. But that's where we stand. I just want to show you from last night a different conversation, but it's related. So I'm reading a book about Brad Thor, I think one of the last books in the series so far, and it's about the hidden order at the Federal Reserve. So he's pretty hyperbolic in his conspiracies, but in he's technically correct about a lot of the stuff. So I basically wrote this thing. This is what I wrote, right? The Fed does good. The Fed is a good insurance policy on the economy, but they went too far. So if you did all of the stuff, every single issue in the economy that the socialists will say, "Oh, capitalism is too wild. You're gonna be exploited." You can have rules. You can if you jail people for doing for being for fraud, and you don't bail out too big to fail, then you wouldn't have this problem. The road not taken, right? We would have been in a much better place. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope I didn't bore you, but I really wanna. There's too many problems. A lot of them are self-inflicted, and if the in some ways the socialist um line of the people are too stupid for their own good is actually true in that sense that if you give your in the socialist way, it's that we need to force the people to do what's better, what's in their own best interest. In the conservative or fiscally conservative economic point of view, not the libertarian point of view, but the economic correct point of view is the people will vote for the politicians who will give them free stuff. And the politicians are it's not a cabal. It's not they're not trying to they're not necessarily malicious out to get you, but to save their own skins, the politicians will not vote for austerity. The banks will keep lobbying against austerity, and the banks will keep lobbying to inflate the bubble. And the Fed is either socialist, trying to do the Green New Deals and for the Democrats, or there's the revolving door with lobbyists from the investment banking, and they're just trying to keep Wall Street afloat. Now, it's not about fraud in Wall Street. We're not talking about secret plans like this book that I'm reading about. It's just an inherently broken system, not the entire system, but the way it's been built. Let's say the structure of the house is stable, but all the wiring is back to front, and it's in reverse incentives. I'll stop lecturing you guys now.